I told you. A few slaps were all it would take to make you obedient, my son Robert said that morning, standing in the living room doorway, observing with satisfaction the impeccably clean house and the table set as if it were a holiday. He was back. Just 24 hours after beating me until I was lying on the kitchen floor, there he was, smiling with that arrogance that only men who believe they've won possess. The table was covered with the ivory tablecloth I inherited from my mother. The good plates gleamed under the morning light, and in the centre, a pitcher of cool water with lemon slices seemed to welcome something important. Robert walked slowly, inhaling the aroma of freshly baked bread, convinced that his fists had achieved what his words never could, taming me. But when he discovered the real reason for that celebration, when he understood for whom that table was truly prepared, he froze completely. Because I was not celebrating his return, I was celebrating my freedom. It all began long before that last blow. It began 7 years ago, on a grey Tuesday in November, when Robert knocked on my door with 2 worn suitcases and a look that broke my heart. "It'll just be a few weeks, Mum," he said, and I, as always, opened my arms and the door without asking questions. My son had lost his job. His wife had left him. He needed a place to recover, and I had this house, too big for a woman alone, too silent since I became a widow. I thought it would be temporary. I thought my love could heal him. I thought many things that turned out to be lies. I told myself to endure what would come next. The first few weeks were tolerable. Robert slept late, watched television, and ate what I prepared. He wasn't looking for work, but he wasn't causing trouble either. I justified his apathy by telling myself he was depressed, that he needed time. I cleaned his dishes, washed his clothes, and when I asked him when he would start looking for a job, he would change the subject or lock himself in his room, slamming the door. I learned not to ask. I learned to walk silently through my own house so as not to bother him. I learned that my life no longer belonged to me. The first scream came in the 3rd month. I had prepared chicken for dinner, but Robert wanted steak. "You can't do anything right," he roared, throwing the plate against the wall. The pieces of cream-coloured ceramic scattered across the kitchen floor like small fragments of my dignity. I knelt to pick them up, apologizing, promising to make whatever he wanted. That night, as I bandaged my finger cut by a piece of the ceramic, I told myself it was my fault, that I should have asked him what he wanted to eat, that I needed to be more attentive, more careful. That's how the downfall begins, justifying the unjustifiable. The screaming became daily. Robert complained about everything. The food was cold, or too hot, or too salty. The house was dirty, even though I spent hours cleaning every corner. I made noise when he was trying to sleep. I didn't make enough noise when he wanted company. I spent too much on groceries. I didn't buy enough. Every day brought a new list of reproaches, and I, like a fool, tried to comply with all his impossible demands. I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning to have breakfast ready by 7 o'clock, even though he rarely got up before noon. I ironed his clothes, even though he never left the house. I cooked 3 different options for dinner, just in case he disliked one. And even so, it was never enough. Within a year, Robert was no longer just yelling. He was pushing. A soft shove when I was in his way, a tug on the arm when I didn't move fast enough. Once he twisted my wrist because I took too long to serve his coffee. "It was an accident, Mom," he said, without looking me in the eyes. And I, dear God, I believed him. Or I wanted to believe him. Because accepting the truth meant accepting that my only son, the baby I nursed, the boy I hugged through his nightmares, had become my executioner. I stopped seeing my friends. Jane would call every week at first, inviting me for coffee, for a walk in the park. But Robert always needed something just as I was about to leave. He was hungry, or had a headache, or just looked at me with those eyes that said, "Don't you dare leave me alone." So I started turning down invitations. Once, twice, 10 times, until Jane stopped calling. The outside world shrank until it was just him and me in this house that smelled of resentment and reheated food. The neighbours noticed things. Mrs. Peterson, who lived next door, once asked me why I had a bruise on my arm. "I fell," I lied, pulling down the sleeve of my olive green blouse. She looked at me with that expression that says, "I know you're lying, but I won't press you." And I felt shame, not for the bruise, but for being such a coward, for allowing this to continue, for becoming a stranger to myself. Money was the next thing he controlled. My widow's pension arrived every month, $1,200 that had been perfectly enough for me to live with dignity before. But Robert had needs. He needed cigarettes. He needed beer. He needed money to look for a job, even though I never saw a single job application. At first, I would give him $20 or $30 when he asked. Then it was 50. After that, 100. Until one day he simply took my bank card and said, "It's easier this way, Mum. I manage the money better." And like an idiot, I gave it to him. I started having to ask his permission to buy my own medication, to buy groceries, to exist. My life was reduced to a series of routines designed to keep the peace. Waking up before him, making coffee exactly the way he liked it. Very strong, 2 spoons of sugar, in the grey mug he inherited from his father. Walking barefoot to make no sound. Cooking without singing, because my voice irritated him. Watching television in my bedroom with the volume so low I could barely hear. Breathing carefully, as if the simple act of existing could provoke his anger. And the saddest thing is that it worked. When I was invisible, when I became a shadow, he was calm. But shadows also have limits, and I was about to reach mine. The definitive break came on a Thursday night. I had prepared vegetable soup because money was running out, and there were only $300 left in the account until the end of the month. Robert walked into the kitchen, looked at the steaming bowl, and his face twisted into a grimace of disgust. "Soup? That junk soup again," he spat the words as if they were poison. I tried to explain that we needed to save, that expenses had been very high that month, that if he wanted to, we could look for ways to reduce costs together. It was a mistake I would pay for with blood. Robert approached slowly, with that terrifying calm that preceded his worst moments. He took the bowl with both hands and flipped it onto the table. The hot soup spilled, staining the tablecloth, dripping onto the floor, splashing my hands. I stood motionless, feeling the liquid burning my skin. But more than the physical pain, it was the fear that paralyzed me. "Do you know what your problem is, Mum?" he said, leaning down until his face was inches from mine. His breath smelled of stale beer and tobacco. "You never learned your place. Dad was too soft on you, but I won't be." What happened next occurred so quickly that my brain took several seconds to process it. His hand smashed into my face with such force that I fell out of the chair. The cold tile floor hit my hip, my elbow, my shoulder. I felt a sharp pain in my ribs. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I could only hear his voice above me, distant and close at the same time. "Get up, clean up this mess, and make something edible, you useless old woman." His heavy footsteps moved away toward the living room. The television turned on. A canned laugh from some show filled the house as if nothing had happened. I stayed on the floor for several minutes. I didn't get up immediately because something inside me had broken, and it wasn't a bone. It was something deeper, more essential. It was the last shred of hope I held that this could get better, that Robert would return to the child I knew. But that child had died a long time ago, if he had ever existed. The man living in my house was a stranger with my son's face and the heart of a tyrant. With slow, painful movements, I dragged myself until I was sitting with my back against the cupboard. I touched my lip and my fingers were stained red. My cheek was throbbing. I could feel it swelling, the skin stretching with the bruise that was already forming. But the worst part wasn't the pain. The worst part was the silence that followed. Robert was in the living room, laughing at the television show, while I bled on the kitchen floor. For him, this was normal. It was Thursday. It was dinner. It was his life. I cleaned the spilled soup with shaky hands. Every movement was agony. Something in my side protested every time I bent over, every time I breathed too deep. Possibly a cracked rib, I thought. But I can't go to the emergency room. What would I say? How would I explain this without admitting the truth? I scrubbed the floor until there was no trace of the soup, washed the rag over and over under cold water, and then stood in front of the sink, looking at my distorted reflection in the dark window. I didn't recognize the woman looking back. She had messy grey hair, sunken eyes, the stooped posture of someone who has spent too much time bowing her head. When had I become this? When had I stopped being Mary and transformed into this frightened creature who existed only to serve and suffer? That night, I didn't prepare another dinner. I simply dragged myself to my bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of my bed. The house was silent now. Robert had probably gone out to buy something to eat with my money, with my card, with my life. I carefully touched my swollen face, and this time, finally, I cried. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of rage, of helplessness, of shame for having let myself get to this point. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Robert returned. I heard his heavy footsteps in the hallway, the slam of his door closing. Then, silence. I stayed awake all night, staring at the ceiling, feeling every pulse of pain in my face, in my ribs, in my soul. And it was in that darkness, in that silence broken only by the ticking of the clock on my dresser, that something changed. It wasn't a dramatic thought or a sudden revelation. It was simpler and deeper than that. It was the cold, clear certainty that if this continued, Robert would kill me. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next month, but eventually one of his blows would be too hard, too accurate, and I would stop breathing on my own kitchen floor while he watched television in the living room. I couldn't let that happen. Not like this. Not after surviving 63 years of life, after burying a husband, after raising a son, after enduring losses and joys. I wasn't going to die like a coward at the hands of my own son. If I was going to die, it would be on my own terms. But preferably, I wouldn't die at all. I would live. And to live, I needed to get out of here. The decision didn't bring peace, but it brought clarity. And clarity, I discovered, was almost as valuable as courage. I got out of bed as the sun began to filter timidly through the window, casting golden lines on the wood floor. My body protested with every movement, but I forced myself to walk to the small desk in the corner of my room. I opened the bottom drawer, the one I always kept locked, and took out an old notebook with brown covers. It was my expense journal, where I meticulously noted every penny that entered and left the house. But among those pages, there was something else. A yellowed envelope with $300 that I had been saving for years, hidden from Robert, my only secret, my only emergency reserve. I counted the bills with trembling fingers. $300. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a start. I also found a folded paper, a card that Mrs. Peterson had given me months ago when she was still trying to help me. On the card was the name of Elizabeth Rodriguez, social worker, with a phone number and an address. "Just in case you ever need to talk to someone," Elizabeth had said, squeezing my hand tightly. I had kept the card, promising myself I would never use it, that things weren't that bad, that I could handle the situation alone. How stupid I had been. I put the envelope with the money in the inside pocket of my robe and hid the card in my bra, pressed against my skin. I needed to keep these things close, invisible, safe. Then I looked at myself in the small mirror over the desk. My face was a map of violence, my lips split, my cheek dark purple, one eye slightly closed from the swelling. I couldn't leave like this. People would ask questions. Robert would find out. I needed to wait, to heal enough so I could move without arousing suspicion. The following days were a careful performance. I became the perfect shadow, the submissive mother Robert believed he had created with his fists. I got up every morning before him, made his coffee exactly as he liked it, served his food without a word, cleaned every corner of the house with silent movements. When he looked at me, I lowered my gaze. When he spoke, I nodded. When he yelled, I flinched. I gave him exactly what he wanted to see, a broken, defeated, tamed woman. But inside, behind my tired eyes and my stooped posture, something completely different was growing. It was coldness. It was determination. It was the version of myself that had been asleep for 7 years and had finally woken up. Robert was satisfied with my transformation. "See, Mum? It wasn't so hard," he said on Sunday morning, sitting in his chair while I served him scrambled eggs with ham. "You just needed to learn who's in charge here. Now everything is much easier, right?" I nodded, kept my head down, and he smiled. That victorious smile made me sick, but it also gave me strength, because while he thought he had broken me, I was planning every detail of my escape. On Monday, when Robert went out to meet some friends, leaving me locked in with specific orders to have dinner ready by 8 o'clock, I took the phone with trembling hands. I dialed the number on the card Mrs. Peterson had given me. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I almost hung up. I almost convinced myself that this was a bad idea, that I could handle it alone, that things would get better. But then a warm voice answered on the other end. "Social Services Office, Elizabeth Rodriguez speaking." And something inside me broke down. I couldn't speak right away. My throat closed, the words stuck behind years of silence and shame. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Elizabeth asked softly. "Yes," I finally managed to whisper. "I need help." Those 3 words were the hardest I had ever spoken. Admitting I needed help meant admitting I had failed, that I couldn't solve this alone, that I was a victim. But Elizabeth didn't judge me. She didn't ask me why I had waited so long. She just said, "I'm here to listen. Take your time." I told her everything. The words came out like water from a broken dam. The beatings, the insults, the control of the money, the isolation, the 7 years of horror I had been living. As I spoke, I paced back and forth in my room, watching the window, terrified that Robert would return and discover me. Elizabeth listened without interrupting, and when I finished, her voice sounded firm and clear. "Mary, what you are experiencing is severe domestic violence. It is not your fault, and I can help you, but I need you to trust me. You can come to my office." I looked at the time. Robert wouldn't be back until night. "I can be there in 40 minutes, I replied. I left the house for the first time in months without Robert's permission. Every step I took down the street felt like a betrayal and a liberation at the same time. The afternoon sun warmed my skin, I wasn't used to being outside, to walking freely. Elizabeth's office was in a beige building 6 blocks away. When I entered, a woman in her 50s with glasses and her hair tied back in a braid greeted me with a smile that held no pity, only understanding. "Mary," she said, as if she had known me all my life. "Come in, please." Her office was small but cozy. There were plants in the windows, landscape photographs on the cream-coloured walls, and a coffee maker emitting a comforting aroma. I sat in a chair in front of her desk, and Elizabeth sat next to me, not behind the desk, but beside me, as an equal. "First, I want you to know something important," she began, looking me directly in the eyes. "What is happening to you is not normal. It is not acceptable, and it is definitely not your fault. Sons do not have the right to hit their mothers. No one has that right." Hearing those words spoken aloud by another person made me cry. Not silent tears this time, but deep sobs that shook my entire body. Elizabeth handed me a box of tissues and waited. She didn't try to calm me or tell me to stop crying. She just waited until I could breathe again. "I'm sorry," I murmured, wiping my face. "Don't apologize for that," she said firmly. "You've been strong for too long. It's okay to break down now. You are in a safe place." Elizabeth pulled out a folder and began asking me specific questions. How long had Robert been living with me? How often did the violent episodes occur? Did I have any proof? Photographs of injuries, messages, witnesses? I shook my head, ashamed. I hadn't documented anything. I had hidden the bruises. I had lied about the falls. I had kept everything a secret. "That's okay," Elizabeth said, writing something in her notebook. "We'll start now. I'm going to take photographs of the current injuries. Do you give me permission?" I nodded. The photographs were humiliating. I had to show my swollen face from different angles, lift my blouse to show the bruises on my ribs, extend my arms to capture the finger marks where Robert had grabbed me tightly days earlier. Every click of the camera was evidence of my shame, but also evidence of his guilt. When we finished, Elizabeth put away the camera and took my hands. "This is very brave, Mary. I know it doesn't feel that way, but it is." We talked for almost 2 hours. Elizabeth explained my options. I could apply for a restraining order, I could file criminal charges, I could seek shelter in a domestic violence safe house. But when she mentioned the safe house, something inside me revolted. "No," I said with a firmness that surprised me. "That is my house. I bought it with my husband 30 years ago. We paid every cent. I buried my husband from that house. I'm not going to let Robert drive me out of my own home." Elizabeth smiled, and for the first time I saw pride in her eyes. "Then we will do this another way," she said. She told me about an attorney who worked with domestic violence cases, a man named Charles Mendez, who could help me regain legal control of my property, my money, my life. "He works with us frequently," Elizabeth explained. "He is good at what he does and doesn't charge for the initial consultation. Would you like me to call him now?" I nodded, feeling something akin to hope begin to grow in my chest. Charles arrived 30 minutes later. He was a man in his 40s, wearing a dark grey suit and a serious but kind expression. He sat down, opened his briefcase, and got straight to the point. "Mrs. Herrera, based on what Elizabeth told me on the phone, you have a solid case. Your son is living on your property without paying rent. He is physically and emotionally assaulting you, and he is controlling your finances. We can work on multiple fronts: protection order, legal eviction, regaining control of your bank accounts. But I need to know, are you ready to do this? Because once we start, there is no turning back." I looked at Charles, then at Elizabeth, and then at my own hands, wrinkled and marked by years of work. I thought of Robert, of his satisfied smile when he thought he had tamed me. I thought of all the years I had lost being his servant, his victim, his possession. And I thought of the woman I had been before, the Mary who laughed, who sang while cooking, who had friends and dreams. "I'm ready," I said. And this time, my voice did not tremble. Charles pulled several documents from his briefcase and spread them out on Elizabeth's desk. "First things first," he said, pointing to a light yellow form. "We need to apply for a temporary protection order. With the photographs Elizabeth took and your testimony, a judge can issue it in 24 to 48 hours. That will prohibit Robert from approaching you, contacting you, or remaining on your property." I listened to every word as if it were a foreign language. For so long I had believed I had no options, that I was trapped, and now this man was telling me that the law could protect me. "And if he doesn't obey the order?" I asked, feeling fear tighten my throat. "What if he gets angry and things get worse?" Charles looked at me seriously. "I won't lie to you, Mrs. Herrera. There is risk. The most dangerous moments in domestic violence situations are when the victim tries to leave or take control. That's why we need to plan this carefully. Elizabeth and I have worked together on dozens of cases like yours. We know how to do it safely." Elizabeth nodded and added, "You are not alone in this. You will have support every step of the way." We spent the next few hours building a plan. Charles explained that we would first file the protection order request at the courthouse. While we waited for the hearing, I needed to regain control of my finances. "Do you have access to your bank statements?" he asked. I shook my head. Robert had taken everything: my card, my checkbook, even the statements that came in the mail. "Then tomorrow we will go to the bank," Charles said, writing something in his notebook. "You are the account holder. You have the right to cancel any additional card, change passwords, and establish that only you can carry out transactions." The idea of confronting the bank, of taking those concrete actions, terrified and excited me at the same time. "What if Robert finds out before we're ready?" I whispered. "What if he checks the account and sees that I cancelled his card?" Charles closed his notebook and looked directly at me. "That's why we need to move fast. Once we make the banking move, we have to be prepared to execute the rest of the plan immediately. We can't give him time to react." Elizabeth leaned forward and took my hand. "Mary, I know it's terrifying, but every day you spend living with him is one more day of risk. You already made the hardest decision by coming here. Now you just need to keep going." I left that office 3 hours after I had entered, with a folder full of documents, a list of steps to follow, and something I hadn't felt in years: purpose. The sun was setting, staining the sky with orange and pink colours. I walked back home quickly, aware that Robert expected his dinner by 8 o'clock, and it was already 7:45. My ribs still hurt with every hurried step, but the physical pain was insignificant compared to the mixture of terror and determination had burning in my chest. I arrived home at 7:30. Robert was in the living room, watching a football game, with his feet on the coffee table and a can of beer in his hand. "You took a long time to go to the store," he said, without turning to look at me. My heart stopped. Had he seen me leave? Did he know where I had been? "The line was long," I lied, keeping my voice calm as I walked toward the kitchen. "I'm going to make dinner now." He grunted something unintelligible and turned his attention back to the television. I let out a silent sigh of relief. That night, as I prepared roasted chicken with potatoes, my hands moved automatically, but my mind was completely elsewhere. I went over the plan again and again. Tomorrow, Tuesday, go to the bank at 9 o'clock in the morning when they opened. Charles would meet me there. We would cancel Robert's card, We would change all access. We would establish that only I could authorize transactions. Then we would go directly to the courthouse to file the protection order request. If everything went well, by Wednesday or Thursday, we would have the temporary order. And then would come the hardest part, notifying Robert that he had to leave my house. I served dinner in silence. Robert ate without a word, focused on his phone, sending messages and occasionally laughing. I barely touched my food. My stomach was clenched with nerves. Every time he moved, I tensed, expecting another outburst, another blow, another humiliation. But that night, he was in a good mood. He had won some money betting on the game, he informed me. $50. We're going to eat well tomorrow, he announced. I want steak, the good kind. Go to the market early and buy the best cut you can find. I nodded, knowing that tomorrow there would be no market, no steak, and if all went according to plan, no more orders. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in bed, watching the shadows, the streetlights projected on the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house, the humming of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the beams, Robert snoring across the hall. I thought of everything that could go wrong. What if the bank refused to help me? What if the judge didn't believe my story? What if Robert discovered what I was planning before we could execute it? The possibilities of failure were endless, and each one terrified me more than the last. But then I remembered Elizabeth's words, "You already made the hardest decision." She was right. The hardest thing wasn't what would come next, but daring to take the first step. And I had already taken it. I had already left the house without permission. I had already talked to strangers about my situation. I had already admitted the truth. I couldn't go back now, even if I wanted to. The process was already in motion. I got up at 5 o'clock in the morning, even though I hadn't slept at all. I showered with warm water, letting the heat relax my tense muscles. I dressed carefully, dark grey pants, a peach-coloured blouse, comfortable shoes. I wanted to look respectable, like the homeowner I was, not the victim I had become. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. The bruises were fading, changing from purple to a greenish yellow, but they were still visible. Good, I thought. Let the judge see them. Let the world see what Robert has done to me. I made coffee for Robert, as always. I placed his mug on the kitchen table, along with toast and jam. I wrote a note, went to the market early to get the best steak. Be back soon. It was a lie, of course, but I needed time. I needed him not to suspect anything until it was too late to stop me. I took my purse, put the folder of documents Charles had given me inside, and left the house at 6:30 in the morning. The streets were almost empty at that hour. The fresh morning air filled my lungs, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something akin to freedom. I walked to a coffee shop that opened early, 3 blocks from my house, and sat by the window with a cup of hot coffee between my hands. I had 2.5 hours before meeting Charles at the bank. 2.5 hours to mentally prepare for what was coming. 2.5 hours to be brave. Charles arrived at the bank exactly at 9 o'clock, his briefcase in one hand and an expression of determination on his face. "Good morning, Mrs. Herrera," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "Ready for this?" I nodded, although my heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. We entered the bank together, and Charles spoke to one of the managers, explaining the situation professionally but directly. 20 minutes later, we were sitting in a private office, and a woman named Patricia was reviewing my accounts on her computer. "I see there is an additional card associated with your account," Patricia said, looking at the screen. "Issued 6 years ago to Robert Herrera. You want to cancel that?" I nodded. "I need to cancel it. Now." Patricia didn't ask questions. She had seen enough cases like mine to understand. Of course. I'm also going to change your PIN, your online banking passwords, and place an alert on your account so that no one but you can authorize changes. Does that sound good? Perfect, I said, feeling a weight begin to lift from my shoulders. When we left the bank 30 minutes later, I had a new bank card in my purse, new passwords memorized, and for the first time in 6 years, total control over my own money. Charles walked beside me with a firm step as we headed to the courthouse, which was only 2 blocks away. You did very well in there, he said, and something in his tone made me feel proud of myself. I had been strong. I had spoken clearly. I hadn't cried or apologized for taking what was rightfully mine. The courthouse was an imposing concrete building with tall columns and hallways that smelled of old paper and disinfectant. Charles guided me through the entrance, past metal detectors and security guards, until we reached an office on the 3rd floor with a sign that read Domestic Violence and Protection Orders. A receptionist handed us forms to fill out. I sat on a hard plastic chair and began writing my story in the blank spaces, reducing 7 years of horror to checked boxes and brief descriptions. When did the last incident occur? Last Thursday. Describe the nature of the aggression. Blows to the face and torso. Have there been previous threats? Yes, constant for 7 years. Charles reviewed each form before I handed it in, making sure it was complete and correct. When we finished, we sat down to wait. The waiting room was filled with women of all ages, some with small children playing quietly with worn toys, others alone with empty expressions that I recognized in myself. We were all here for the same reason. We had all reached the point where surviving was more important than maintaining appearances, more important than love, more important than anything else. A young woman sitting next to me had a sleeping baby in her arms and a completely swollen eye. Our eyes met for a second, and in that second we shared everything. The fear, the shame, the determination, the hope. We didn't say anything. We didn't need to. At 11:20, an assistant called my name. Charles and I entered a small office where a judge in her 60s, with short silver hair and glasses, was reviewing my file. Mrs. Mary Herrera, she said, without looking up, I have reviewed your application and the attached photographs. I am going to grant an emergency temporary protection order valid for 15 days. In that time, a formal hearing will be scheduled where your son may present his side, and I will decide whether the order is made permanent. My heart leaped. 15 days? It seemed like such a short time and an eternity at the same time. The judge continued, This order states that Mr. Robert Herrera is prohibited from approaching you within 100 yards, contacting you by any means, and must immediately vacate the property located at the address you provided. The police can enforce this order. If he violates it, he will be arrested. She signed the document in black ink, stamped an official seal, and handed me a copy. Take this seriously, madam. If he contacts you, call the police immediately. Do not negotiate. Do not speak to him. Do not give him opportunities. Your safety comes first. We left the courthouse with the protection order in hand, and Charles took me directly to the police station. We need an officer to go with you to your house to notify Robert and supervise while he gathers his belongings and leaves, he explained. At the station, an officer named Ramirez, a stocky man in his mid-30s with a serious expression, read the order and nodded. These cases are delicate, he said, looking directly at me. I will take you to your house. We will notify your son, and he will have 1 hour to collect his essential belongings and leave. If he refuses, we will arrest him for contempt. If he becomes violent, we will arrest him for assault. You don't have to speak to him at all. I'll handle it. The ride back to my house was surreal. I was in the back seat of a patrol car, with Charles in his own car following us, and Officer Ramirez driving in silence. I looked out the window at the familiar streets, the houses where I had lived for 30 years, and everything seemed different now. I wasn't running away. I was returning. But this time, I was returning as the owner, not the prisoner. When we arrived at my house, I saw Robert's car parked in the driveway. He was home. My stomach twisted into a knot of panic. Officer Ramirez must have noticed because he said in a firm voice, "Breathe, I'll handle this. You just need to stay behind me and not say anything unless I ask you directly." Charles approached and put a hand on my shoulder. "You're doing the right thing, Mary. In a few minutes, this will be over." We walked to the front door. I took out my keys with trembling hands and opened it. Inside, the television was on at full volume. Robert was on the sofa, exactly where I had left him so many times, with his feet on the coffee table and a beer in his hand. When he saw us enter, his expression changed from confusion to fury in a second. "What the hell is this?" he roared, standing up. "Why did you bring the police to my house?" "It's not your house, sir," Officer Ramirez said in a calm but authoritative voice. "This property belongs to Mrs. Mary Herrera, and I have a protection order here that prohibits you from remaining on these premises." He extended the document toward Robert. Robert took it roughly, his eyes scanning the lines quickly, and then he looked at me with an expression that chilled my blood. It was pure hatred. "You did this?" he asked in a dangerously low voice. "You betrayed me like this, you miserable old woman?" I wanted to answer. I wanted to explain. I wanted to scream all the years of pain he had caused me. But Officer Ramirez stepped between us. "Mr. Herrera, you have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings and vacate the property. If you attempt to contact, intimidate, or approach Mrs. Herrera, you will be arrested immediately." Robert clenched his jaw, crumpled the paper in his fist, and for a moment I thought he was going to attack us. But the presence of the uniformed officer, the hand near his belt where the pistol hung, was enough to stop him. "Fine," he finally said, his voice laced with poison. "I'm getting out of this piece of junk house. But this isn't over, Mum. It is not over." Officer Ramirez took a step forward. "That sounded like a threat, Mr. Herrera. I suggest you choose your words more carefully." Robert didn't respond. He simply turned on his heel and went up the stairs toward his room with heavy footsteps that shook the entire house. Charles guided me to the kitchen while Robert gathered his things upstairs. "Sit down," he said, pointing to a chair. "Breathe. It's almost over." But I couldn't sit down. I was trembling from head to toe, adrenaline rushing through my veins like electricity. I could hear Robert moving things, opening drawers, swearing. Every noise made me jump. Officer Ramirez stood at the foot of the stairs, watching, with an expression that left no room for negotiation. 20 minutes later, Robert came down with 2 large suitcases and a backpack. His face was red with fury, the veins in his neck bulging. He walked past me without looking, but I felt his hatred as something physical, tangible. He dropped the suitcases next to the door with a loud bang and turned to the officer. "There. Can I leave now? Or are you going to arrest me for breathing too?" Officer Ramirez didn't take the bait. "You can leave. And remember, 100 yards distance from Mrs. Herrera at all times. 0 contact. If I see you watching this house, if you call her, if you send someone to speak to her, we will be back with handcuffs." Robert took his suitcases and walked out the door without another word. I heard his car start, the screech of the tires as he pulled out of the driveway too fast, the sound of the engine moving away down the street. And then, silence. A silence so complete, so profound, that for a moment I didn't know what to do with it. Officer Ramirez closed the front door and locked it. "He's gone," he said. "It's over." Was it over? I didn't know. My legs gave out, and I had to grab the back of a chair to keep from falling. Charles held my arm. "Sit down, Mary. It's over now. It's done." But it didn't feel like it was done. It felt like it was just beginning. Officer Ramirez stayed for 20 more minutes, checking all the locks on the house, making sure the windows were securely closed, explaining the steps to follow if Robert tried to return. "Keep your phone charged and close at all times," he said, handing me a card with the direct station number. "If he shows up, if you see him nearby, if you receive any kind of contact, call 911 immediately. Don't wait. Don't hesitate. Don't think you're overreacting. These cases can escalate quickly." I nodded, putting the card in my blouse pocket. Charles added his own phone number on a piece of paper. "I am also available. 24 hours. Anything, Mary. Anything at all. You call me." When they finally left, I stood in the middle of my living room, surrounded by a silence that was completely mine for the first time in 7 years. The house felt strange, as if it were a new place, even though every piece of furniture, every crack in the wall, every stain on the carpet was as familiar as my own skin. I walked slowly from room to room, touching the surfaces, reclaiming my own space. In the kitchen, Robert's plate was still in the sink, with remnants of dried food. I picked it up and for an instant considered washing it by reflex. But then, something inside me revolted. I dropped it into the trash can. I was not going to clean up his messes anymore. Never again. I went up the stairs to his bedroom, the room that had been a guest room before he arrived, and turned it into his personal fortress. The door was open. Inside, the mess was monumental. Dirty clothes piled in the corners, empty beer bottles on the floor, plates with half-eaten food on the desk. The smell was nauseating, a mix of sweat, tobacco, and neglect. He had left many things, posters on the walls, boxes of personal items, a broken lamp, but I didn't care. All that could wait. I closed the door and decided that room would exist for me only when I was ready to face it. That first night alone was the strangest of my life. I prepared a simple dinner for myself, just for me, vegetable soup and toast. I sat at the kitchen table without watching the clock, without calculating when he would arrive, without planning what I would say if he disliked the food. I ate slowly, savoring every spoonful, and it was the first meal in years that I could digest without my stomach clenching with fear. Afterward, I washed my plate, only my plate, and left everything clean. I turned off the lights, checked the doors twice, and went up to my room. I lay in bed, but I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house made me jump. The wind hitting a window, the creaking of the beams, the engine of a car passing on the street. My heart raced, waiting to hear his heavy steps, his key in the lock, his voice roaring my name. But he didn't come. The hours passed slowly, marked by the clock on my nightstand. 11 o'clock, midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock. And little by little, as the silence stretched unbroken, something inside me began to relax. I was alone, truly alone, and for the first time in so long. That wasn't scary. It was peace. The following days were an exercise in relearning how to live. I woke up without alarms, made coffee only for myself, ate breakfast when I was hungry, not when someone else ordered it. I cleaned the house at my own pace, without haste, without panic. I opened the curtains and let the sunlight in. I put on music, something I hadn't done in years, because Robert was bothered by noise. I sang while I cooked. My voice sounded rusty, out of tune from lack of use, but I didn't care. It was my voice, in my house, and no one could silence me. Elizabeth called me every day during that first week. "How are you? Have you heard from him? Do you feel safe?" Her questions were professional, but genuine. I told her about my days, about the small acts of freedom I was rediscovering, sleeping late, eating ice cream straight from the container at midnight, watching television shows that I chose. "That's good," she would say. "You are rebuilding yourself. Take your time. There is no rush." Charles also called, keeping me informed about the legal process. The formal hearing for the permanent protection order was scheduled for 10 days away. Robert had been officially notified. He would have the opportunity to show up and give his side. "Do I have to see him?" I asked, feeling panic tighten my throat. "You will have to be in the same room," Charles explained, "but there will be security. He won't be able to approach you. I will be with you the entire time. Elizabeth will be there too. You are not alone in this." Those words had become a mantra. You are not alone. After 7 years of isolation, of believing I had no one, of thinking I had to endure everything in silence, discovering that there were people willing to help me was overwhelming and beautiful at the same time. On the 5th day after Robert left, I dared to leave the house. Not to run necessary errands, but just to walk. I put on a lavender dress I hadn't worn in years, brushed my hair and left it down, and walked out onto the street under the afternoon sun. I walked through my neighborhood as if seeing it for the first time. I waved to Mrs. Peterson, who was watering her plants in the garden. Her eyes lit up when she saw me. "Mary, it's so good to see you. You look different." "I feel different," I replied. And it was true. Something in my posture had changed. I no longer walked stooped, with my gaze lowered. I walked with my head held high. Mrs. Peterson put down the hose and approached the fence that separated our houses. "I heard your son left," she said carefully, without judging. I nodded. "He left, and he is not coming back." She smiled, a small but meaningful smile. "I'm glad, Mary. I'm very glad. If you ever need company, or just want to have a cup of coffee, my door is always open." For the first time in years, I accepted the invitation. I would love that. "Tomorrow, does that work for you?" "Perfect," she said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice. That night, while preparing dinner, I heard a car stop in front of my house. My heart froze. I ran to the living room window and looked carefully through the curtains. It was an unfamiliar car, black, with tinted windows. It stayed there, with the engine running, for what seemed like hours but was probably only 2 minutes. Then it drove away. I stood trembling, with the phone in my hand, ready to call the police. Was it Robert? Someone he had sent? Or just a neighbor visiting someone down the street? I didn't know, but the fear returned, raw and paralyzing, reminding me that even though Robert no longer lived here, his shadow still stretched over my life. I called Charles. He answered on the second ring. "Mary, what happened?" I told him about the car. He listened without interrupting and then said, "Did you see anyone inside? Did the car do anything threatening?" "No," I admitted. "It just stayed there, parked." "It's okay," he said in a calm voice. "It's normal to be hypersensitive after what you've been through. It might not have been anything, but you did well to call me. If it happens again, write down the license plate and call the police. They can check. And Mary," he paused. "Breathe. You are safe. The doors are locked. You have emergency numbers. You are not defenseless." Those words helped me calm down. He was right. I was no longer the defenseless woman Robert had tried to create. I had taken action. I had sought help. I had a protection order, allies, resources. If he tried anything, I wouldn't stay silent. I wouldn't hide. I would fight. That night I slept with the phone on the nightstand and a baseball bat I found in the garage under the bed. I would probably never use it, but knowing it was there gave me a sense of control. The days continued to pass. I reconnected with Jane, my old friend who had stopped calling after so many rejections. When I dialed her number, after years of silence, my voice trembled. "Jane, it's Mary." There was a pause, and then her voice, warm and surprised. "Mary? My God, how are you? It's been so long since I heard from you." "I know," I said, feeling tears burn my eyes. "I'm so sorry. I had problems, but I'm better now. And I was wondering if you'd like to get coffee with me sometime." We arranged to meet on Saturday. When the day came, I was as nervous as a teenager on her first date. I got ready carefully, choosing clothes that made me feel like myself, not the shadow I had become. Jane hugged me when we met at the coffee shop, a long, strong hug that made me cry. "I missed you," she whispered. "Me too," I replied. I didn't tell her everything that day. It was too much, too soon, but I told her enough. That Robert no longer lived with me, that I was getting my life back, that I needed to reconnect with the people who mattered to me. She listened, held my hand across the table and said, "I'm here. Whatever you need. Always." The hearing was scheduled for Tuesday at 10 o'clock in the morning. The night before, I could barely close my eyes. I stayed awake, mentally rehearsing what I would say, how I would behave, what I would do if Robert tried to intimidate me with looks or words. Charles had prepared me. The judge will ask you questions about the incidents of violence. Answer honestly, calmly. Don't let yourself be provoked if Robert or his lawyer try to make you angry. Maintain your composure. The truth is on your side. But knowing what to do and being able to do it were two completely different things. I got up at dawn, showered with almost cold water to wake myself up completely, and dressed in the most formal suit I had, charcoal grey pants and a cream-coloured blouse. I wanted to look serious, respectable, like someone whose words deserved to be heard. I put on a little makeup to cover the last shadows of the bruises that still lingered on my cheek, although part of me wanted to leave them visible, wanted the judge to see exactly what Robert had done to me. But Charles had said the photographs would be sufficient evidence. "You don't need to display your wounds to be believed," he had explained. "Your testimony and the evidence speak for themselves." Charles picked me up at 8:30. Elizabeth was waiting for us in the courthouse parking lot. When the elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor, my stomach twisted into a tight knot. There were more people than I expected. Other women waiting for their own hearings, lawyers reviewing documents, security officers standing in the corners. And then I saw him. Robert was at the end of the hallway, sitting on a wooden bench, dressed in a white shirt and dark pants, as if he were going to a job interview. Next to him was an older man in a black suit who must have been his lawyer. When our eyes met, a chill ran down my spine. His expression didn't show anger. It showed cold, calculated contempt, as if I were an insignificant annoyance that would soon be eliminated. Charles put a hand on my shoulder. "Don't look at him. Focus on me. He can't do anything to you here." Elizabeth stood on the other side, creating a protective barrier. We sat on the opposite bench, as far away from Robert as possible. The minutes crawled like hours. At 10 o'clock sharp, an assistant opened the courtroom doors and began calling names. Case number 4732, Mary Herrera versus Robert Herrera. My heart was beating so fast, I was sure everyone in the room could hear it. The room was smaller than I had imagined. There was a table for each party, a witness chair, and at the front, elevated on a platform, the judge's bench. The same woman who had signed my temporary order was there, reviewing papers with a serious expression. Charles guided me to our table. Robert and his lawyer sat at the opposite table, less than 10 feet away. I could feel his presence as something physical, oppressive, but I forced myself to keep my gaze straight ahead, to breathe, to remember why I was here. The judge looked up. "Good morning. This is the hearing to determine whether the temporary protection order issued on the 18th of this month should become permanent. I have reviewed Mrs. Mary Herrera's initial petition, the photographs of the injuries, and the written testimony. Mr. Herrera, you have the right to present your side. But first, Mrs. Herrera, I would like to hear directly from you. Please approach the stand." My legs trembled when I stood up. Charles gave my arm a gentle squeeze before letting me go. I walked to the witness chair, sat down, and placed my hands on my lap to hide how they were shaking. The judge looked at me with a neutral but not cold expression. "Mrs. Herrera, tell me in your own words what led you to request this protection order." I took a deep breath. It was now or never. It was my chance to tell the truth, the whole truth, without fear of the consequences. "Your Honor," I began, and my voice sounded firmer than I expected. "My son Robert came to live with me 7 years ago, when he lost his job. I took him in because he was my son and I thought he needed temporary help. But what started as support turned into control. He never looked for work. He took control of my money, my house, my life. He would yell at me if the food wasn't exactly how he wanted it. He would push me if I moved too slowly. He constantly insulted me, calling me useless, old, stupid. I stopped seeing my friends because he always needed something when I tried to go out. I stopped making decisions about my own life because I was afraid of his reaction." The judge listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes. I continued, feeling the words flow more easily now that I had started. 2 weeks ago, I prepared soup for dinner because money was running out. He became enraged, said it was garbage, and flipped the bowl onto the table. When I tried to explain that we needed to save, he hit me. He hit me in the face with such force that I fell to the floor. Then he kicked me in the ribs while I was lying there. And afterward, he went to the living room to watch television as if nothing had happened. My voice cracked slightly, but I continued. That night, I understood that if I didn't do something, he would eventually kill me. Not because he is a monster, but because he had learned that he could hit me without consequence. I had taught him that by allowing it for so long. Robert made a sound of disgust from his table. His lawyer put a hand on his arm, silencing him. The judge gave him a warning look before turning her attention back to me. "Is there anything else you wish to add?" I thought for a moment. There was so much more. The years of psychological humiliation, the nights sleeping in fear, the loss of my identity. But I decided to end with something simple and direct. "I just want to live in peace in my own house, Your Honor. I don't want revenge. I don't want to hurt him. I just want him to leave me alone." I returned to my seat. Charles gave me a look of approval. Now it was Robert's turn. The judge called him to the stand. He walked with confident steps, as if this were a minor inconvenience, and sat with a relaxed, almost arrogant posture. "Mr. Robert," the judge began, "you have heard your mother's testimony. What is your version of the facts?" Robert cleared his throat. "Your Honor, with all due respect, my mother is exaggerating everything. Yes, we had a disagreement over dinner. I was frustrated because she knows I don't like soup, and she still prepares it constantly. I got upset. I admit I raised my voice, but I never hit her. She tripped and fell on her own. She has always been clumsy, especially at her age. Rage boiled inside me, but I bit my tongue. Charles had warned that Robert would likely lie, that he would deny everything or minimize his actions. The judge reviewed the photographs in front of her. Mr. Robert, the injuries documented here are consistent with direct blows, not an accidental fall. A split lip, bruises on the cheekbone in a finger pattern, contusions on the ribs. Are you saying that all of this was the result of a stumble? Robert hesitated for the first time. I don't know how she got all that. Maybe she hit something when she fell. I wasn't paying attention after the incident. I went to the living room. His lawyer stood up. Your Honor, if I may, there are no witnesses to this supposed attack other than Mrs. Herrera. There are no contemporaneous medical reports of the incident. My client admits there was an argument, that he became agitated, but he adamantly denies hitting his mother. Furthermore, I would like to point out that he has lived in that house for years without any prior problems. Why is it that suddenly, after all this time, she is bringing these accusations? It is suspicious, Your Honor. It could be an attempt to evict him from the property for personal reasons unrelated to violence. Charles immediately stood up. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is speculating about my client's motivations without any basis. Furthermore, the absence of prior medical reports is precisely characteristic of domestic violence victims who live in silence out of fear, not evidence that the abuse did not occur. And regarding the lack of witnesses, domestic violence by its nature occurs in private. That is precisely why it is so difficult to combat. The judge raised a hand. Both of you sit down. I understand the arguments of both parties. A silence fell as the judge reviewed the documents in front of her. I held my breath. This moment would decide everything, whether I could live in peace or if I would have to constantly look over my shoulder. Finally, the judge spoke. I have carefully considered both testimonies, the photographic evidence, and the typical patterns in domestic violence cases. Mrs. Herrera's injuries are extensive and consistent with physical assault. Mr. Roberts' explanation that they were caused by an accidental fall is not credible given the pattern and severity of the contusions. Furthermore, Mrs. Herrera's testimony describes a pattern of controlling and abusive behavior that extended over years, not an isolated incident. My heart was beating so fast I felt like I might pass out. The judge continued. Therefore, I order that the protection order be made permanent for a period of 3 years. Mr. Robert Herrera is prohibited from approaching Mrs. Mary Herrera within 100 yards, contacting her by any means, or remaining on the property located at the aforementioned address. Any violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and criminal charges. Furthermore, I order that Mr. Robert attend an anger management program as a condition. This hearing is concluded. The bang of the judge's gavel echoed in the courtroom like a liberating thunder. 3 years. I had 3 years of legal protection, 3 years to rebuild my life without constantly looking over my shoulder. Charles leaned toward me and whispered, You did it, Mary. You won. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like survival, like having climbed a mountain only to discover there's another on the other side. Elizabeth hugged me when we left the room. I am so proud of you, she said, and her words made me cry tears I had been holding back throughout the hearing. Robert walked out of the courtroom behind us, his face contorted in a mask of contained fury. For a moment, our eyes met in the hallway. In his eyes, I saw something that chilled my blood. Not remorse, not shame, but a promise. The promise that this was not over for him, that he would find a way to make me pay for having humiliated him publicly. A security officer immediately approached, stepping between us. Mr. Herrera, maintain your distance. The order is already in effect. Robert looked away, said something quietly to his lawyer, and headed toward the elevators without looking back. Charles escorted me to his car. My legs could barely support me. The adrenaline that had kept me standing during the hearing finally dissipated, leaving me exhausted and trembling. "I want you to know something important," Charles said as he drove me back to my house. "What you did today took immense courage. Most people in your situation never take this step. They stay silent until it's too late. You saved yourself, Mary. Don't forget that." His words were etched in my mind like an invisible tattoo. When we arrived at my house, Charles insisted on checking all the locks again, verifying that the windows were secure, making sure I had all the emergency numbers programmed into my phone. "The first few days after an order like this are critical," he explained. "Robert is furious. He might try to contact you through other people. He might send messages from unknown numbers. He might try to manipulate you emotionally. Don't respond to anything. Any attempt at contact, however small it may seem, report it immediately." I nodded, memorizing every instruction as if my life depended on it. Because perhaps it did. That night, I prepared a special dinner for myself. It wasn't elaborate, just pasta with homemade tomato sauce and salad, but I prepared it with intention, with self-love, celebrating the fact that I could now eat in peace. I set the table nicely, with the tablecloth I liked, lit a candle, and poured myself a glass of wine that had been stored in the cupboard for years. I ate slowly, savoring every bite, and for the first time in a long time, the food didn't taste like fear. It tasted like freedom. The following days were quieter than I expected. There were no strange cars in front of my house, no calls from unknown numbers, no signs of Robert. Part of me was relieved. Another part was uneasy, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I knew my son. I knew his temper. He wasn't the type of man to accept defeat gracefully, but perhaps, just perhaps, the legal intervention had been enough to scare him, to make him understand that his actions had real consequences. I started going out more. I reconnected with more old friends. Jane invited me to her book club, a circle of women who met every 2 weeks to discuss books and drink tea. The first time I attended, I felt like an imposter, as if I didn't deserve to be there with these women who laughed freely and talked about their lives without shame. But they welcomed me warmly, without asking invasive questions, and little by little I began to feel part of something bigger than my own tragedy. Mrs. Peterson became a regular visitor. She came 2 or 3 afternoons a week, brought homemade cookies or fruit from her garden, and we sat in my kitchen drinking coffee and talking. We didn't always talk about deep things. Sometimes we just commented on the soap operas, the weather, the neighborhood gossip. But her constant presence reminded me that I wasn't alone, that there were people who cared about me without wanting anything in return. One afternoon, 3 weeks after the hearing, I was watering the plants in my garden when I saw a white envelope in my mailbox. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was an unsigned card with only 3 words written in tight handwriting. "This is not over." My blood ran cold. It was Robert's handwriting. I would recognize it anywhere. He had violated the protection order. I ran into the house, locked the door, and immediately called Charles. He arrived in less than 20 minutes, accompanied by a police officer. They took photographs of the card, saved it as evidence, and filed a formal report. "This is a direct violation of the order," the officer explained. "We are going to issue an arrest warrant for him. Do you know where he might be living?" I shook my head. I had no idea where Robert had gone after leaving my house. I didn't have his new number. I didn't know who he was staying with. The officer wrote everything down in his notebook. "Stay alert. If you see him near your property, call 911 immediately. Do not attempt to confront him." I nodded, although the thought of Robert showing up at my door filled me with paralyzing terror. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed sitting in the living room with all the lights on, the phone in one hand and the baseball bat in the other, waiting to hear footsteps on the porch, a window breaking, his voice yelling my name. But the night passed in silence. At dawn, exhausted and trembling, I finally allowed myself to close my eyes for a couple of hours. 2 days later, the police arrested Robert. They found him in a bar 6 blocks from my house, drunk and openly talking about how I had betrayed him, how he would make me pay. Someone in the bar, concerned about his erratic behavior, called the police. When the officers arrived and checked his name in the system, they discovered the outstanding arrest warrant. They handcuffed him right there, in front of all the bar patrons. Charles called me with the news. "He's detained, Mary. He will spend at least 72 hours in custody while they process the charges for violation of the protection order." The news should have relieved me, but I only felt a strange emptiness. This was my son, the baby I had carried in my arms, and now he was in a cell for threatening me. At what point had everything gone so terribly wrong? "It's not your fault," Charles said, as if he could read my thoughts through the phone. "Robert made his own choices. You only protected yourself. Never forget that." 6 months passed since Robert's arrest. 6 months in which I learned to live again, to breathe without constant fear, to recognize my own reflection in the mirror. The house that had been my prison slowly transformed into my sanctuary. I painted the living room walls a soft peach color, a warm shade that reminded me of tranquil sunrises. I transformed the room that had been Robert's into a small studio where I began to practice watercolor, a hobby I had abandoned decades ago. Every brushstroke on the canvas was an act of reclamation, a statement that my life belonged to me again. Robert was sentenced to 8 months in jail for violation of the protection order and threats. When he got out, the order would remain in effect for 2 more years. Charles explained that he would probably try to appeal, that he might try to contact me again when he regained his freedom. "But by then," he said with a small smile, "you will be even stronger than you are now." And he was right. Every day without him, I recovered another piece of myself that had been lost. One Thursday afternoon, exactly 7 months after the hearing, I decided to do something I had been putting off. I prepared that table that Robert had seen when he returned the day after hitting me. The same table that had confused him, that had made him believe his fists had tamed me. But this time, I prepared it for the right reasons. I invited Elizabeth, Charles, Mrs. Peterson, Jane, and 3 more women from the book club. I prepared a hearty dinner: herb-roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, roasted vegetables, and for dessert, a chocolate cake I baked myself following my mother's recipe. When they arrived, the house was filled with light, soft music, and the aroma of homemade food made with love. Charles brought wine. Elizabeth arrived with fresh flowers, bright yellow. Jane hugged me in the doorway and whispered, "Look at everything you've built." And it was true. I had built something beautiful on the ruins of my pain. We sat around that table, the same one that had witnessed so much violence, and filled it with laughter, stories, and celebration. We were not celebrating Robert's downfall. We were celebrating my resurrection. During dinner, Charles raised his glass. "I'd like to make a toast to Mary," he said, and everyone fell silent. 7 months ago, I met a woman who had been beaten, controlled, and stripped of her dignity. But that woman found the courage to get up, to seek help, to say enough. And today I look around and I see that same woman, but transformed. I see someone who not only survived, but is flourishing. Mary, you are an example that it is never too late to take your life back. To you. Everyone raised their glasses. "To Mary," they said in unison. I had to wipe my tears with my napkin. Elizabeth shared something afterward. I have worked with domestic violence victims for 15 years, she said, and I have seen everything. Women who return to their abusers again and again, women who don't survive to tell the tale, women who manage to escape, but are broken forever. But I have also seen women like you, Mary, women who turn their trauma into strength, who don't let the violence define who they are. You chose to live, you chose to fight, and you chose to heal. That is extraordinary. Her words resonated with me in a profound way. I had chosen. At every step of the way, from that first phone call to this moment, I had made active decisions to save myself. That night, after everyone left, I stayed alone in my kitchen, washing the dishes with my hands submerged in warm, soapy water. I looked out the window at the dark garden and thought about the whole journey. I thought about the woman I had been, the one who allowed herself to be hit and controlled because she thought she deserved nothing better. I thought about the woman I was now, the one who had friends, projects, hope. They were not the same person. I had died on that kitchen floor 7 months ago, and I had been reborn stronger. Robert would eventually get out of jail. He would probably still be the violent and resentful man he had always been. But that was no longer my problem. I had done my part. I had set boundaries. I had sought legal protection. I had built a support network. If he chose to change, good for him. If not, that was his cross to bear, not mine. I was no longer responsible for saving him or enduring him. My only responsibility was to myself. The following months continued to bring small victories. I fully regained control of my finances and discovered that Robert had spent almost $25,000 of my savings during the years he lived with me. Charles helped me file a civil lawsuit to recover some of that money. I would probably never see a dime, but the very act of reclaiming what was mine had value. I enrolled in senior yoga classes at the community center. I started volunteering at a domestic violence shelter, helping other women navigate the same process I had gone through. Sharing my story, seeing how it gave hope to others, healed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. A year after everything, on a sunny spring afternoon, I was sitting in my garden painting wildflowers when Mrs. Peterson peered over the fence. "Mary, you have a visitor," she said. My heart raced for a moment of instinctive panic, but Mrs. Peterson smiled. "It's Elizabeth." Elizabeth walked into the garden with a folder under her arm. "I came to give you something," she said, sitting in the chair next to me. She opened the folder and took out a certificate. "You officially completed the Survivor Recovery Program. This is for you." It was a simple piece of paper, but it meant everything. It meant I had done the work. I had attended therapy, processed my trauma, learned tools to never return to that dark place. "Do you know the most incredible thing about you?" Elizabeth asked, looking at me with bright eyes. "That you are 64 years old and still had the courage to start over. Many people your age think it's too late to change, to get out of bad situations. But you proved that it's never too late." I smiled, feeling the warm sun on my face. "It's never too late to choose to live," I replied. "That's what I learned. As long as you breathe, as long as you have a voice, you can choose something different." That night, I stayed up later than usual, sitting on my porch with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the stars. I thought of Robert, wherever he was. I wished him peace, genuinely. Not because he deserved my forgiveness, but because I deserved to be free from the weight of resentment. He had been the villain of my story, but I had chosen to be the hero of my own rescue. And that choice, that decision not to wait for someone else to save me, but to save myself, had made all the difference. The house behind me was lit, warm, full of life. my life. And although the road had been painful, although the scars would always remain, I was here, I was alive, I was free. And that, after everything I had been through, was all I needed.